when you read our history, it explains a lot about who we are and why we're the way we are and why we're always leaders in not only BC, but Canada as a whole.
For such a long time, we had to do things according to the Indian affairs. This is how you spend your money. This is what you're going to do on this day. This is how you're going to plan. And yet that wasn't where we came from. Our ancestors were making decisions, and sometimes they weren't consulted. So much land we lost in someone else's decision.
And like our grandfathers told us, you can't stand by and watch the business and the wealth going by and you standing there with your hands out like that. You need to be part of it.
I just remember thinking, there's got to be a way to utilize these things that the past Indigenous leaders have been working so hard for so long, coming through colonization, discrimination, all these roadblocks.
Within the confines of a Western socio and economic world, how do you financially exist in this modern world as a modern Nisg citizen? How do you plan for yourself for a better life?
How do you reconcile with our people? Reconciliation is a big word that has many, many ways of looking at. We are a distinct nation as a non-Nisg. You can assist by not trying to make us the same as you are. Hoogklip algega dit kon ren de achtem bulach agus skiet en garo en samam dem ren kanksiel niska het lacht kon naam samag het halo.
The Nisg Nation values our language, our culture, and our traditions, because that's our identity.
I'm really proud of our Nisg leadership for grooming us in the way they did. And the way they thought, not lose sight of the traditions and cultures of our nations from the past. They still work today.
We refer to ourselves as Alugigat. Alugigat ni Lissams with each other. I live in Lissams Valley.
And the river provides the resources that we need, the fish that we eat, and all of that.
At the mouth of the river, we could get seafoods. And the land right around it, you could get other animals for food. Or they call it was in Lissams. Was is your bowl that contains food.
We're comprised of 4 modern communities, but there's a composition of approximately 30 to 40 traditional communities that existed along what we call the Nass River, which is the Lissams.
The dances that you're sharing, the stories and the songs that you're singing, it's your history. Each piece of that totem pole, you'll see that each figure on there tells a chapter of the chief and his family's history and his wealth and what happened during those days. So you go to any museum and you look from the bottom to the top and you'll see every figure is different because that's a chapter in the life of that family. Right? Adaw, that's what it's called. It's a story, right? Adaw. Every single family in this nation owns it. Every single tribe that sits on a river, the Gitsan, the Shimshan, the Haidas, the Tlingit. So that's the history that we learn.
For Nisg, to be Nisg, especially a woman, I carry it with pride because I've worked really hard to get to where I am. I've always had the love to work for our people. Nisg, I've always been proud to be working within our own whelps, our own houses, in our own tribes as a team.
Our matriarchs, when you have the gift to create and bring life into the world, you have the responsibility to nurture and to nourish this life so that it becomes whole and balanced. One could be gifted to create clothing, One could be a storyteller, someone who can offer a hug, someone who can prepare foods, someone who can gather foods, and fathers and uncles provide. Our definition for a chieftain, for example, Sim Augit, the literal translation according to our ancestors is Sim Ha is Kungya. Sim is very, Ha is literally useful, Gyat, person. But the deeper meaning for them is person who is an honest and trustworthy provider, someone who doesn't make demands, but shares the responsibility and shares the knowledge without fear. It's not about control. It's about working together.
The acquisition of Indigenous lands in the late 1700s, 1800s, all throughout this area, the deaths of our people through smallpox created a time when our people had really succumbed to a lot of pressure from colonial powers.
People that came in from Europe knew who the powerful people were, and when they brought in things like alcohol. Alcohol was a way in which they create division between the younger ones and the older ones, and that just carried on from generation to generation, and a lot of bad things happened because of it. For myself, I've witnessed a lot of violence, not just in the home, but like throughout our whole community.
Still, the impacts of colonization, the impacts of colonial practices, which are reiterated in provincial or federal practices and laws, still negatively impact many people, including Nisga'a people, both in community and outside of community.
Young artists like myself should be able to go back and reminisce for our grandfathers about doing this. Same way I did, because I would give anything to go to a museum in Paris or Germany, New Zealand. Thousands of pieces stolen, what I say, from our past.
I loved reading, write a little bit of poetry, love telling stories, and I love hearing. Words are my passion, because I want to know the roots of it. Why is it that way? So that's a little bit of my background, but I went to residential school, was sexually abused and stuff. That's why I started to say I want to own me, because I can't blame people for what happened, because they don't know it's their fault. I have to own that so that it doesn't hurt me anymore. I could use it as a teaching tool as opposed to something that could hurt somebody else.
Carving and dancing actually brought me back from a darker world I was in, alcoholism and drug abuse. It made me transform myself back into the roots that I came from. So rather than falling down and losing myself in this world, I was able to go back and take a fallen tree, so to speak, stand it back up and recarve it, bring myself to where I am at today, and transform myself. I do a transformation mask, a dance too, where I'll use the transformation mask and open it and just, let go. Nobody knows inside that I'm thinking about the abuses I suffered at residential school. That's what's happening. A transformation is taking place. And I don't have to think about that in a bad way, because now I can do the transformation mask dance. And it's a good thing to see, from a bad thing that happened.
A lot of our leaders talk about the shackles of the Indian Act. The Indian Act is an act that allowed Canada to dictate, control all those words, Indigenous people within Canada. Can you imagine having a mother and a father letting go of their child at 5 years old to be taken and be placed in a residential school? That's what happened. And my mother was she was a young mother. She was widowed at 30 with 6 children. So 3 of her children were taken and put in residential school. I was about 5 or 6 myself when I was taken. Yeah. My mother also went to residential school. Her parents also went to residential school. So it was a generational thing. It wasn't a very happy situation, but I survived, as we all have to do.
I think a lot of the challenges that we see with Indigenous nations, such as substance abuse challenges, can be attributed to trauma. So I think trauma is one of the most challenging issues that we have as a people that we recognize could be understood a lot better.
And I came home to work for our people so that we wouldn't be controlled, so that we would understand our rights, our human rights especially.
Life and land are the most valuable things to Nisga'a people. We don't make rules to hurt our people. So we don't judge people whether they're a drug addict or an alcoholic, or some people's terms are lazy. When somebody is calling asking for help, a leader is supposed to say, how can I help you? And this is the way it's done. You reach out to your hands. So leaders have to continually think like that of how you're going to make laws simple, not build it up with tools of how to take away. That's not the way you govern or lead.
Even under the pressure of institutes such as the residential school, Indian day schools, boarding home schools, the Nisga's have always been leaders.
Our leaders, a lot of them are on that wall over there, and others have gone to the Happy Hunting Ground. They were very innovative, and it was through their hard work that we made things happen through legal victories and achieving the first modern day treaty. And it's because of the knowledge that they instilled in all of us, their children, their grandchildren. Many of the leaders on the wall there have grandchildren that are in office now. So it's gone a long way.
If you think of the 1913 petition, where our hereditary leaders decided that we need to settle with the white men who came to our lands, our leadership all spoke with one voice to pull together all of the tribes and our people, united in pursuing the land question.
Back in 1887, our ancestors, pressing to settle the Nisga'a land question, climbed into their canoes and paddled down the coast of British Columbia to Victoria's Inner Harbor, where, on the steps of the Parliament buildings, they were sharply turned away by Premier Smythe. And like a handful of politicians today, Smythe refused to discuss the Nisga'a land question, wrongly convinced that assimilation of Aboriginal people was inevitable. As a result of that decision, he plunged the province into 100 years of darkness for the Nisga'a and other Aboriginal peoples.
Our forefathers, they came up with how to involve everybody. All of the chiefs said we're stronger working together as one. So they threw all of their resources, all of their lands and resources in what we call a common bowl. There's a symbol of that in our legislative chambers.
The Indian Act didn't allow us to be equal participants in Canada.
It was illegal for Indigenous people to hold office or let alone vote until after the Second World War. In 1949, the first Indigenous person ever elected to any legislative body in Canada was Frank Calder. Frank used to come up to Stewart. He used to hang out with my dad and work on strategies for lobbying the federal and provincial government for government services, for education, for healthcare, for transportation. My dad was a white man. Frank was Indigenous, working together as Northerners.
The Nisga'a Nation's always been willing to be leaders, be first movers in anything that we do. Willing to take that risk to take the government of British Columbia to court back in the late 1960s and got our decision of the Calder case in 1973, which opened the door for us to begin negotiations. And a lot of other nations didn't support our leadership in that time, but they were willing to take that risk. They had the confidence that they were going to get what they wanted.
I was the CEO for the Nisga'a Nation for the last 10 years and Director of Lands and Resources prior to that. I was part of the negotiating team that negotiated the treaty. When the treaty was ratified, finally, after some very long sessions within the House of Commons in Ottawa and British Columbia, there were people out the public who said, see, you've negotiated a treaty successfully. Man, I don't know if this is gonna work at all. And, well, 20 years later, the treaty is very much alive and it's moving forward.
The initialing of the final agreement is a triumph for the Nisga'a people, the people of British Columbia, and indeed the people of Canada. Today we make history as we correct the mistakes of the past and send a signal of hope around the world. Today, let us talk about reconciliation and a new understanding between cultures.
The first three speeches ever made in the chambers, Dr. Gosnell, late Dr. Gosnell, he stood up and he said, no elected member should ever come into these chambers with a hidden agenda to undermine the decisions of our government. And then the late Dr. Frank Calder stood up. He said, given all of my years of experience as being an elected person, know why you are making laws, know why, and then know how to. And then one of our elder chieftains, he stood up and he said, keep these chambers as sacred, keep it as a holy place, because in here you are making decisions about life and for life. We don't have time to fight. If you want to fight, you stay outside these chambers. And so when I got home that evening, I shared with my wife, Nita, the three speeches. And she said, wow, that's a pretty high standard for a government, to be transparent in your actions and to be knowledgeable in your decision-making. And above all, to be mindful that government is a sacred institution because it is about life, nothing else.
We've been under self-government for just over 20 years now. And how well have we done? I think we've done really well.
And for me, it means that the Nisga'a are rising up from the ashes of the Indian Act.
In the 1990s, along the Nass River, where young kids were walking along the mud and kicked something on the ground and said, what is this? And they started to dig it out, and it was a copper shield about that big. And it was beautiful. It's quite unique because that's one of the most powerful pieces of symbolism that we have.
The copper shield is a hayatsk. It's a symbol of wealth and knowledge.
It was a symbol of stature, a symbol of dignity, a symbol of respect, and it symbolizes our nation. We actually give it as a gift and call it a passport to come onto our lands. There's stories associated with them of Nisga'a chiefs coming ashore when his daughter was going to get married and was throwing the copper into the river to show the family that this means nothing to me. And where were we getting those copper shields from? And people were like, well, when Westerners arrived, we were teaching you guys how to use metal. No.
In 1774, it was even noted by a Spanish sailor, first one to come up to the Nass, Juan Francisco de Bodega came up, and he noted these were piled up in the longhouses, hundreds of them, copper shields. So back then, long before explorers came, our people knew the value of metal. They knew it was in the ground. And they knew what it was worth.
Prior to that, Indigenous people were mining for thousands of years in the upper basins, all throughout our territory: gold, silver, copper. And copper was one of the biggest ones, probably because it was so easily workable at the time, and they utilized it a lot.
The mining industry is one of the resource areas in the general area who were receptive to where we were coming from, and recognized that we had a place on this land.
Historically, from a more modern, engaged perspective, the relationship in the 70s and 80s was quite a challenging relationship. It culminated with the 1980s exercise in AMEC and the work that occurred in the Kitsault, where the Nisg Tribal Council at the time really went at AMEC about the devastation that they were creating in the region. So we have an entire government and lands department that actively engages with mines and actively engages with mining explorers in regards to activities on our land.
Generally, the relationship is very good with the mining companies.
I think that's been one of the most positive impacts, because it means opportunities and jobs for so many.
We have some of our youth now looking at getting into the mining business in terms of technical work.
Overall, mining has provided a substantial influx of good careers to the Nisga'a citizens. A few of them have also climbed the ladder in their trades. We have a few millwrights, welders, a couple of machinists, a number of heavy equipment operators, and we actually had two that just are about to retire that have worked in the mining field for a number of years.
So I was born into a mining family. I was born in Nelson, BC. My dad is an underground miner. First 2 years of my life, I spent living at the mine house on site. There was actually a Teltan training opportunity that was presented for Bruce Jack. From that mining opportunity, I got to travel all around to all these mineral investment conferences and really opened my mind up to how mines are started, how they're funded, and the teams and the capacity that's needed to kind of move responsible development forward.
We now have a voice where the mining camps hear us. We meet with them on a quarterly basis. We have that working relationship through our IBAs, our benefits agreements.
The benefits that we receive from the mining companies, along with employment opportunities to our people, include revenue payments to the Nisga'a Nation, which translate into the royalties that we have.
I remember working for the Tahltan central government in the past and looking at all the royalties and all the other different income streams that they already own. All the past leaders that have brought the Tahltan Nation to where they are, royalties on all these different mineral assets and be part owners in hydro assets, they finally got them, they own them, we have them. How do we leverage them in a way that can bring the value forward and amplify it?
Some of the ideas being put forth that talk about the multi-billion-dollar Indigenous industry and how that multi-billion-dollar Indigenous industry isn't just in Indigenous services that receive funding through the federal government or through the provincial government. It's actually the Indigenous nations recognizing their economic might that they have sitting right in their hand.
We're moved into an age of technology and innovation. Nisga's always put themselves in leadership for innovation. We've always done something first, the treaty and all of that. We've taken a step first. But all of these things that we're having, these big major projects, this nation's royalties, it's going to generate a lot of new resources from future leadership. And so for us right now, today's leadership, we have to ensure that tomorrow's leadership have all of the tools to manage wealth.
And today, present day, we have the Nisga'a Treaty. And for the future, we can look at true self-government with what nations can help us do.
Nations Royalty is majority Indigenous owned. It's a majority Indigenous board of directors and a majority Indigenous management team. So we are uniquely positioned to help create a pathway for them to get the higher value from these assets, because these are Indigenous royalties, it's Indigenous wealth, and it belongs to stay in Indigenous hands.
This opportunity is one opportunity that's going to allow us to grow capital for our people.
It's not a new model, it's more of an old model with a new twist. The mining royalty model is actually quite old and very well established and proven out. There's dozens of existing mining royalty companies out there today.
And Nisg, they said, let's float their royalties in a public company, but with a difference. Let's ask and invite Indigenous groups from around the country and potentially from around the world to join Nations royalties by pooling the royalties together that are paid to Indigenous groups, mining royalties or oil and gas or clean energy or other commodities that we will be targeting in one common company.
You see that this venture that we're in, that was initiated through a relationship that was developed between Rob McLeod and Frank Calder from way back, and then Frank Gistra, a man who moves things without fear, someone who is willing to offer his knowledge and trust to ensure that we are willing and brave enough to stand and do it. That's who we are.
All we did with Nations Royalty was apply the same principles of the common goal to a modern financial instrument. First Nations groups have an asset, but that asset wasn't delivering to their immediate needs. So we created the structure that gives them wealth that is immediate and usable today as opposed to 10, 20, 30 years from now. And it will allow them to then make their own economic decisions. What are they going to invest that money in? They create all of this value. Now they have access to wealth that they can develop other industries, build schools, and whatever it is that they deem appropriate to better the community.
We're so pleased to join you here today at this beautiful location to celebrate the listing of Nations Royalty on the TSX Venture Exchange that listed on June 21st. Nations Royalty is a landmark listing for us. It's being the first Indigenous-based royalty issuer in the country, a partnership between the trend-setting Nisg Nation and experienced capital market entrepreneurs and financiers.
For the future, I see success. I see a lot of success. Long after I'm gone, it's going to be there for our children and our grandchildren. We're going to have that capacity building as we move forward with Nations Royalty.
I see us being only accountable to ourselves and nobody else, because we do get funding from Canada for governance, infrastructure, and other programs and services. And that's what our people wanted. They wanted us to create an opportunity where we don't have to rely on Canada, where we make our own decisions on what gets developed in our nation. And it's going to allow us to address a lot of the needs that are within our community, housing, poverty, maybe making mental wellness a big priority, breaking the cycle of alcohol, drugs, and violence.
I have to be optimistic in respect of our children who are coming up and our children's children, and that the Nisga'a Nation would flourish. But I know that there are a lot of shortcomings, like every community, that need to be addressed. And that's the whole intent of the work that is being done to secure a future for our young people, our communities, and to move forward with Nations Royalty as an example, as one example, to have the Nisga'a Nation flourish for generations to come.
So I'm happy about today, because here's a venture, an initiative that could bring all of us Indigenous peoples together, because we can't always do things alone. We have to work together, and we have to share the responsibility.